Welcome to another show of Justice Matters. My name is Patricia Corrales, and as many of you know me, I go by Patty Corrales. And my show focuses on immigration-related issues. As a former senior attorney for ICE for over 17 and a half years, I'd like to talk about issues pertaining to the immigrant community. And my show focuses on different aspects of the law: criminal, civil, immigration, and how it impacts the immigrant community here in our community. And so today we're going to talk about bankruptcy and how bankruptcy laws and regulations and or bankruptcy policies affects the immigrant community. Now, bankruptcy often has a very negative connotation. It makes people feel that they're not responsible, or it has, these, quote unquote, negative connotations. And often the immigrant community doesn't realize that they may avail themselves of the bankruptcy laws. So today on my show, I have a very special guest. I have attorney Daniela Romero. And Daniela, welcome.
Welcome. Thank you very much for having me today, Patty.
Could you please introduce yourself to the community?
Yes, my name is Daniela Romero, and I've been a California attorney for over 16 years now, and I'm located in Pasadena, and I serve the San Gabriel community and the Los Angeles community.
Daniela, thank you so much for coming on my show and discussing bankruptcy laws and how it affects the immigrant community. But before we do and talk about this distinct implications with immigration, can you share with us a little bit about bankruptcy and the two different chapters that we often hear about on radio stations and ads that people can avail themselves of?
Yes, there's Chapter 7, which is the simplest form of bankruptcy that most people would like to file. It's very simple. It's pure liquidation. And then there's Chapter 13, which is more of a repayment plan. There's income requirements as far as Chapter 13 goes, and debt limits. For instance, if you have over $1 million of secured debt, or over $360,000, roughly $360,000 in unsecured debt, then you cannot file a Chapter 13. You'd have to file a Chapter 11, which is another reorganization, but for larger debt limits and for corporations mostly,
Now, of the two that you just talked about, Chapter 7 and Chapter 13, let's talk about families. Mm-hmm. And in particular, immigrant families. Often, immigrant families work the very, difficult labor jobs, and they are often, sometimes, if they can't produce social security cards that are valid, they lose their jobs. And with the economy and the recession and the implications of the housing market, many of our immigrants have lost their jobs. Of the two types of chapters that you just referred to in the bankruptcy arena, which chapter is the best, if you will, that a family should avail themselves of?
It all depends on the family's goals. If, for instance, they're in a home and they have arrears on their house that they haven't been able to pay, or they're under what's called underwater, where they have two mortgages and the value of the house is worth less than the first mortgage, and they want to strip the second mortgage off, then they would want to file a Chapter 13, because you can only do that in a Chapter 13. But you also need regular monthly income in order to file a Chapter 13. If the goal is just to get rid of debt and the person no longer has a job, then they would want to file a Chapter 7 if they could.
All right, and I think that actually, in a very simple way, explains the differences of both Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. You talked about arrears. Arrears, just so that our community understands, is just the back pay you owe.
Yeah,
is that right?
Back mortgage. If you haven't been able to pay your mortgage a few months, that would be called arrears. And you could pay that into a Chapter 13 plan.
But not in a Chapter 7 plan.
No, not in a Chapter 7. And, there are a lot of things that you have to be careful about in deciding what chapter to file. I've seen so many people get into trouble by filing the wrong chapter. I've seen people lose their homes by filing a Chapter 7 when they should never really have filed a Chapter 7. So it's really important to talk to a professional that understands what they're talking about.
Well, bankruptcy law often, as I mentioned early on in the show, has such a negative, filing for bankruptcy, I should say, has such a negative connotation. And I'm certain in your line of work, I mean, that's why I've never become a bankruptcy attorney. It's very complicated. It's very numbers driven. It's very, very, very specific. And so I want to ask you, in terms of individuals, people who are here unlawfully, is bankruptcy available to them?
Yes, bankruptcy is available. There's nothing that says you have to be a U.S. citizen, in the bankruptcy laws. You have to just be domiciled here. You have to either own a business, own property, or work here, and be domiciled here to file. You don't need a Social Security card or a Social Security number. You can use an ITN number, and you just need a government-issued ID,
Yeah, and you talked about something. You mentioned Social Security number or Social Security card. Mm-hmm. I have often individuals who come to my office for a consultation who have used either bad Social Security numbers in the past or have had false Social Security cards or fraudulent Social Security cards, because for many in the immigrant community, they need to work. And if they need to work, sometimes they resort to measures that in our eyes may be against the law, but they're measures that for them, that's the only way they're going to be able to get work. And these are individuals who work hard. And, aside from that one little implication of using a false Social Security number or a false Social Security card, they're otherwise very moral people who've just come to this great country to better their lives for themselves and for their families. With that, the notion that they've used Social Security cards that are false in the past, or numbers, Social Security numbers that don't pertain to them, would that affect their ability to file for bankruptcy?
Yes, it could. But, here is where it's really important to coordinate with maybe an immigration attorney, and a bankruptcy attorney that knows what they're doing. There are many people who have used false Social Security numbers, and it is a crime to do that. It's it is federal crime. So it is something that they have to be very careful of. Especially if they've used more than one false Social Security number. They can file with their ITN number, but they have to be aware that it is prosecutable. Now, will it be prosecuted? In talking to some U.S. attorneys and to some Chapter 7 trustees and other attorneys who have been practicing for a long time, it's really driven by the district that you're in and the court that you're in. It's a crime, but it's also the least prosecuted crime, in bankruptcy. So you have to be, careful. You have to know your district, know your court. It's something, there's a lot of gray area, and I'm reticent to, say, yes, you can, or no, you can't file, right, because, it is a gray issue. I talked to somebody from the U.S. Trustee's office that said, this is something that's really important here, especially in the Los Angeles area. You have immigrants that, you don't want them to end up in a debtor's prison for the rest of their life just because they used a wrong Social Security number at one point. There are mitigating circumstances. Let's say you realize that you shouldn't have used a false Social Security card. What you have to do at that point is you get your ITN number, you notify creditors that you used a false number, and the credit reporting agencies, and then you file bankruptcy. Of course, you're going to have to swear under oath, and file a a document in the bankruptcy court that says that you used a false Social Security number, but is it prosecutable?
That's the question. And just so that we can, make clear to the community, as you said, using a false Social Security number or obtaining a false Social Security identification card is a crime, and it's a federal crime. It's governed by federal law, and therefore subject to the terms and conditions of the various statutes that are applicable for someone who violates that crime. You talked about, is it prosecutable? There are so many in the immigrant community who have had to rely on false Social Security cards because that's the only way they can work. And while a violation of the law, like we said, it's also, if you will, presents itself in a situation where there are mitigating circumstances that can be taken into account for the very reasons that they are here using this number, because they need to work and they need to provide for their families and their children and things of that nature. But in my experience as a former prosecutor for ICE, and I've never seen, unless it's such an egregious fraud, I've never seen an individual who's used a Social Security card necessarily prosecuted, because the amount of resources to go after all these individuals who've used false Social Security cards will take, it's a great deal, and I don't think any prosecutor's office will have that ability to prosecute all these individuals. So I do believe it comes to the discretion of the U.S. Attorney's Office whether they'll go after someone or not, and they have their own guidelines in which they make those decisions. But again, we cannot say yes or no, as you said, but unless there is more fraud involved or an egregious element to the particular issue, I think their mitigating circumstances would be taken into account.
And I want to correct myself. Not is it prosecutable, but will it be prosecuted?
Right.
It's just up to the discretion of the U.S. Attorney's Office. And it doesn't usually come from the immigration standpoint. It would come from the bankruptcy court standpoint. And but if you had a really good immigration attorney, helping you out, for instance, if somebody were to be prosecuted, and in the Central District at this point right now in Los Angeles, there really are no cases. One Chapter 7 trustee that I spoke to said in the 60 to 70,000 cases that he's been Chapter 7 trustee over, he has seen maybe, he can't even count the number on one hand, of people who have been prosecuted for using a false Social Security number. Mm-hmm. So, but I've heard, for instance, in Riverside, in Orange County, they do prosecute that more than, for instance, in Los Angeles.
Well, it's good, I think, like you said, always to talk to a licensed attorney who both specializes in bankruptcy as well as in immigration, so they can discuss with them the implications of any, should they be prosecuted, should they be convicted of using a false Social Security card, how would that affect them in their immigration matters, if they're in deportation proceedings or removal proceedings, or if they've got a petition that's pending with USCIS where they're trying to immigrate lawfully into the United States. But touching upon the same area, if I can, Daniela, if you could tell us how likely, if you will, I think what I'm trying to get at for many of our communities, many of the individuals here who are not lawfully here, who have no legal status in the United States, are afraid to avail themselves of many different things, not just bankruptcy, but, for example, deferred action, which was the policy that our president announced in June of last year, where it allowed for the dreamers, if you will, the young youth to apply to be able to obtain work authorization in our country and to work legally in our country, and to have any kind of deportation deferred against them. And yet, although this is a positive thing for many of the youth in our community, I find that many are still afraid to apply because they fear that if I go through the system, someone's going to tell on me or my family and let them ICE know that we're here illegally. I want you to talk to us a little bit about the bankruptcy procedures, if you will, in the process. When you go to bankruptcy court, is it likely that a bankruptcy, the court or the individuals involved, the trustee or anybody, would refer an individual who is not here unlawfully to immigration?
Oh, I've never seen that happen. It's just, it all boils down to whether they've used a false Social Security number to try to discharge debts. So in bankruptcy court, they're just looking at whether you can discharge debts. Now, if you've used a false Social Security number to get into debt, there is the possibility that, if, for instance, a creditor could try to come into the court and say that the debt shouldn't be discharged, and because of the fact that they used a Social Security number. But the argument is, did the creditor really rely on, getting a false Social Security number to give out, credit? Probably not, right? So I don't see, a creditor winning on that argument. But, just I think the most important thing to do is to really talk to somebody that's a professional, that knows what they're doing, that can guide somebody through this. The goal of the federal bankruptcy laws is to give people a fresh start. They have, like you mentioned, some of the instances why somebody would get into so much debt. The immigrant population should be able to avail themselves of our laws and to be able to get out of debt and to get a fresh start. So it's really, really important, because you don't want a whole population of people to be in debtor's prison for the rest of their life just because they're afraid of availing of themselves of the system.
Now, you mentioned that word twice now, debtor's prison. What exactly is that?
Well, it's almost like being in prison, because you're in this debt with, a high amount of debt that you have, no ability to really pay back over. You look at the life of the debt and the interest that's being added on. So you have somebody that's looking at, almost being in prison for the rest of their life, in debt. And that's exactly what the bankruptcy laws are there for, to be able to give people a fresh start.
Now, several years ago, though, the bankruptcy laws were amended to make it a little more difficult to file Chapter 7 or to file Chapter 13. Is that still the case? And I think in our immigrant community, and for those individuals who are working hard in this country but cannot make things meet, cannot make their financial situation in their home, meet all their needs, they're for certain can file for bankruptcy.
Oh, for sure, they can file for bankruptcy. You just need somebody to do what's called a liquidation analysis and what's called a means test, and it's based on their income and the number of people in their family. And there's federal guidelines, and also each state has their own means income, to be evaluated.
Now, when someone files...
Sorry, and that's just to file a Chapter 7.
A Chapter 7.
You do the means test also for a 13, but that just tells you whether somebody would be in a 3-year plan or a 5-year plan.
Now, if I can discharge all my debts, why would I pick Chapter 13 where I have to repay my debts?
Well, there's certain reasons why you would file a 13. One would be that you earn too much income to file a Chapter 7, right? And then you would just file a 13 instead, and you would go on a repayment plan for 3 to 5 years. Another would be that you want to strip a loan off of your home. For instance, if, like we mentioned, if the fair market value of the house was less than what was owed, right? There's a way of stripping off a second mortgage, for instance, and making it like credit card debt. Oh. You can do that in a Chapter 13. There's also a way of stripping down a car loan, for instance. There are requirements. You have to have owned it for more than 910 days, and the fair market value of the car has to be less than what the loan is.
Okay.
So those would be two goals that you want to achieve that you can't do in a 7.
So you would have to go with a Chapter 13. And again, very complicated laws, very complicated process, and so always good to talk to someone who specializes in bankruptcy laws. Now, I want to just talk a little bit about, if you can, what's the cost? I mean, if they can't afford to pay their bills, right? What is the cost to go through bankruptcy, or is there?
Well, that also it's really based on what the individual attorney charges. It's based on the type of chapter. Some attorneys will have payment plans. And each district is different. Also, there's general orders that most of the different courts, the chief judges of the different courts will have these no-look fees, and it's usually posted on their website, what attorneys are allowed to charge. There are bankruptcy petition preparers, but I've seen so many people lose so many things by using some of, I'll see people that'll go with the least expensive, person, but sometimes that ends up being the most expensive for them because they either lose things that they didn't have to lose.
Well, these bankruptcy petition preparers are very similar to what we have in the immigration context. We have what's called notarios, or notaries, where they prepare these immigration filings for individuals, or petitions or applications, and often do it either wrong or insert or implicate false information, which then comes across as one negatively for the immigrant when they're before immigration asking for a benefit. So it has serious implications if you don't go to someone who is licensed to practice law.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, the bankruptcy paperwork is usually about 60 pages, and it's all under penalty of perjury that you're signing things, and it has to be explained to you. It is more complicated than what most people think, and a lot of times, when you go to somebody that's doing the wrong thing, or not, or just, doing a shoddy job, you'll get instances where you don't disclose things that you should have disclosed, and that's under penalty of perjury, and you can lose your ability to, get a discharge of your debt.
So you may not be prosecuted for using a false Social Security card, but if you fail to disclose something or have something that's false on your bankruptcy papers that was made under penalty of perjury, you could be actually your debt may not be discharged, but you actually could be prosecuted for false statements.
Exactly.
For perjury itself. So
that's why it's so important. People don't take bankruptcy seriously enough, but it is a very powerful law. There's so many things that you can do in bankruptcy. You can stop wage garnishments, you can stop foreclosures, just by filing. And it is very, very, important for you to give the right information, on your schedules.
Well, and that's good to know. One last topic that I want to touch on before we close today, and that is, how long does it stay on your credit report, bankruptcy?
Well, it stays on your credit report for 7 to 10 years, and it's not such a negative mark that most people think, because you can increase your credit score even with a bankruptcy on your credit. There are things that you can do to increase your or rehabilitate your credit after filing bankruptcy, and a lot of creditors like lending to people after they filed bankruptcy, because they know you can't file for another 8 years, especially your Chapter 7. So it doesn't stop you from getting credit. What it does stop you from is getting credit with a very low interest rate. So you may be offered higher interest rates. Okay. But like I said, there are things you can do to increase your credit rating and then get a lower interest rate.
But it certainly doesn't stop an individual who's not here lawfully from obtaining another job or anything like that. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I just want to touch a little bit about the immigration implications, and certainly talk to an individual, licensed attorney who specializes in both bankruptcy law and in immigration law. In the immigration context, a bankruptcy filing may affect someone who is being petitioned by a U.S. citizen spouse or a parent, if that spouse or parent filed for bankruptcy, because they have to be able to show that they are not going to be, if you will, inadmissible because they're going to be public charges. So the petitioner, the individual who's petitioning that immigrant, needs to be able to show that they've got the funds to support that individual. So a bankruptcy may have implications. Again, very important to talk to someone who is both licensed in bankruptcy, who's a licensed attorney who specializes both in bankruptcy as well as in immigration. But I think one of the things that Daniela made clear today is bankruptcy and its policies and is available to those who are not here lawfully. And if you are in a situation where that's the only option you have, you can avail yourselves of the federal bankruptcy laws, and don't be afraid simply because you're not here lawfully. From what Daniela has told us today, it's available to you, and it's unlikely that they are going to refer your situation or you personally to immigration. That just really doesn't happen. So I want to thank Daniela today for being with us. And Daniela, if people want to speak with you further and want to make an appointment with you to consult about their situation financially, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, my telephone number is 626-817-2611, or they can go onto my website at pasadenabankruptcylaw.com. And I have all of my information there, and they can just call me or email me too.
Well, thank you again for coming on my show and speaking about this very important topic. As you said, bankruptcy is a very complicated process and requires anyone, whether you're immigrant or not, to speak with someone who's actually knowledgeable in this. And if any of you out there have any further questions about immigration-related issues or bankruptcy-related issues, feel free to contact me as well at patricia.m.corrales@gmail.com. Thank you again, and we'll see you soon.